Here we are, Renee. Another podcast. Tell me what we're talking about today.
Hey, today we're going to do a deeper dive into alcohol and the culture around it and all the things with stigma and all the challenges that we face, especially in rural America with alcohol. And speaking of rural America, before we get started, what is going on with the farm?
Well, it's harvest, right? Harvest is full tilt. And, since we're talking about alcohol, I'll tell you, there's still, I think, 57 cans of Busch Light in my fridge because we've got a neighbor who used our field cultivator. We have a little field cultivator. We took the wings off. We just use it for, just small little patches here and there. And so he needed to do his garden. And so, late into summer, early fall, he came and got it. He says, well, what do I owe you for that? We said, well, nothing. We don't use it very much. It's just, for hobby farming now and then. You need something small to go do little patches of CRP or something. And lo and behold, he keeps bringing us these 30 packs of Busch Light, Renee. Now, I don't know if you know anything about me, but I won't drink a 30 pack of Busch Light ever. Um, and so now we've had two sitting in the fridge. I don't think it's even good anymore. But I tell you that story because it tells us how prevalent it is to show appreciation. I get a 30 pack, then another 30 pack, a 60 pack of Busch Light in
Mm,
my fridge, right? So it just tells us alcohol is used for a lot of things, bartering, you
so
name it.
much,
And what does that do? What happens to that as we think about the meaning of alcohol?
right? There's just a lot to unpack right there. First of all, he's got bad taste in beer. Bad taste. And then second of all, you're right. He's trying to be gracious and trying to give you something in exchange, but it's interesting. Reminds me way back when my dad was one of the more rural psychologists. We weren't in a tiny town, but we were in a pretty rural part of Illinois, and he would get barter requests sometimes, and it would be like parts of pigs and
Yeah,
lawn mowing in exchange for services and different things. And I'm pretty sure none of that was what he's supposed to be doing ethically. But when you're in a smaller town and you're the professional that could provide a service, sometimes he would take what people would give him because he'd want to help people. And then he
right.
also wouldn't want to tell them no because people want to be generous in return, right? They want to
Hmm.
feel like they've contributed. So he would get some very strange things sometimes in exchange. But my dad didn't drink, so we never got the 30 pack of Busch Light. That wasn't a thing for him. So and if he did, he never told us. Maybe he did, we just didn't know. But got a lot of other strange things. So thinking today about this with rural alcohol specifically, thinking about it's a whole thing. It's not, alcohol is a big thing in America in general, but in rural America, there's very few things that are separate from this. And we've talked about this throughout our time on this podcast a couple of times. But when you start thinking about it, what goes better with farmers than beer, right?
Well, right. Every country song starts with a can of beer and ends with an empty can of beer, I think. And so, when we think about the prevalence of alcohol use, of how it's marketed, one of my favorites is Farmer Water. I don't know if you've had Farmer Water, but that's a new branded beer that's out and about. I think about Busch Light for the farmers. I just think about how prevalent alcohol is at events, how prevalent it is to, have a beer in the cooler and that's promoted in commercials that we see. If you're out fencing all day long, you should reach in the ice cold cooler and pull out a can of beer. And I can tell you, after I've been out fencing all day and I'm all sweaty, I want a Propeller or a Gatorade. I certainly am not refreshed necessarily by a can of beer, but that's just me, right? And I think it's important that we acknowledge that that culture just propagates problem drinking to some extent.
Yeah, it really does. And some of the folks too, it does, it can relax your body. The alcohol can relax your body. So I'm sure what they're thinking about is people that are working hard, that are tired, sore muscles, all that, just to let you have some relaxation. But to your point, it doesn't really quench your thirst or like hydrate you. It actually does the opposite. So it's not
Mhm.
like scientifically really doesn't do what we think it does. But boy, is it marketed as if it's like the best thing. I've had a long day's hard day of work, construction or whatever, farming, and you need a beer. And that really is ingrained in our culture. I also think this time of year it's football season, which is one of my favorite seasons.
Right.
But I think about tailgating and the numbers of people and the amount of alcohol. And it starts super early in the morning and all day. It's drinking all day long and going into the
Yep.
stadiums. And our college stadiums were alcohol free for a long time, but not so
Right.
much anymore. Even college stadiums now allow alcohol inside, and that's a newer a newer thing. But even thinking through that, in rural America, football is everything. Gosh, I tell you about the year that my husband tried to wear an Iowa State shirt into Nebraska. I thought we were
Oh,
going to get our tails kicked. The only thing that would have been worse, and people yelled this at us, was good thing that's not a Hawkeye shirt. And so rural America, man, they're all about their football, right? It's a
yeah.
big deal, but it's alcohol is 100% of what it's about and the tailgating. And we've talked about this with our statistics and stuff, but the binge drinkers are those middle-aged people at the tailgating games.
Well,
That's who's binge drinking.
and we see more and more of this at the conferences we attend.
Oh,
I've
yeah.
been to probably 20 conferences in 11 different states now. As I look back, I was just reflecting on the year of how kind of broad we traveled. At every one of those conferences, there's been social events,
Mhm.
at the end of the first day or kicking off a conference. And usually it's unlimited drinks, and usually there's a couple people who drink a little too much, a couple of the vendors maybe, and so it really is part of the culture. And so, when we think about stigma, when we think about the stigma around substance use disorders, it is different in rural areas. And I can tell you in some of the rural conferences, because that's primarily where we go, like you don't get tickets. Like a lot of times in the urban conferences, you get one or two tickets, or you get,
Mhm.
somebody sponsors it. In the rural areas, it's just an open bar. And
Yeah.
and so I've kind of started to kind of keep track of these things a little bit, and what does the message that sends is, do we really need that social lubricant all of the time? Have we become so, do we use that so much as a crutch to be able to be social? And I think we just should question that now and then.
Well, I wonder if too if it's just because in the Midwest may not feel like there's as much excitement to do or, great venues maybe to take people for an exciting social activity. So to fix that, you just add more alcohol to it. I mean, I laugh and think about the place that has the networking on the boat that we affectionately call the booze cruise, like the show The
Yep.
Office. For all of you, the
Yep.
American version of The Office with the booze cruise. If you don't know, you should check
Yep.
it out. But anyway, we have been on that thing now twice, and it's exactly like that. But I swear it's because we're in that community off season. There's not a lot going on. And so they put us on this off season boat on the lake. And I think it's just unlimited drinks because that's what makes it tolerable. I mean, and they start with tickets, but really, I mean, even that, there's tickets, but not
Right.
really because everybody else will just hand you their tickets or you
Right.
could play your party games or whatever the heck you could do to get more tickets. So yeah, I get it. But I think really in the Midwest, this is a big thing. And we look at our states and our maps of alcohol and the sales. I mean, they're double digit increases year over year in alcohol sales across time. And so it's not slowing down. It's really not slowing down. And it may change like what types of beer based on inflation and based on, but the general gist of alcohol isn't slowing down. So I
Yeah,
also
and
think
it
stigma is a challenge, right? We've talked about that
right.
too in this space.
Yeah, it draws people, right? And so I think we need to think about what messages are we sending. And so when we think about stigma, I always like to get back to prevention too at some point, right? Is what are the message we're sending? And almost 30% of rural youth aged 12 to 20 report using alcohol
Mm,
in the most recent national survey on drug use. And I think that's a big deal, right? Because
yeah.
we've normalized alcohol use so much, even to those underage. Alcohol isn't considered high risk. Alcohol is just considered a part of living in rural America. It's just part of what you do is when you're bored, you drink. And I think that's part of the culture we find ourselves in. And then how is it now we grapple with that moving forward?
Yeah, I think we have pictures of family members, I won't name who, that have pictures of them as little kids, where the parents thought it was cute with them having a beer can in their hands, trying to drink the beer, or it's in the picture next to them. And I've seen lots of people in our generation that'll have similar photos available where they may be out at the beach or they're, out at the lake, whatever, and they've got beer cans are all around them, and they're like 2 years old, and the parents thought these were cute pictures, and you're like, this is generational and this is years and years and years to get to this point. So this isn't like a new situation by any stretch, but we're living right in the middle of it. But that's just, we're so ingrained in the culture now because it's everywhere. It pervasive through all activities, all events. I think the Iowa State Fair we just attended this year back in August, and goodness, if that's the highlight is so many locations of alcoholic beverages And now different types of beverages. It's not just beer. It's making those special mixed drinks for the folks who didn't like beer, and making the slushies for the people that are hot, and making the wine types of drinks and sangrias and stuff for those, and mimosas for breakfast. And so there's people at the beer tent bright and early in the morning because they're doing Bloody Marys and mimosas. And so it's now not just an evening type activity for social. It's like an all day, come and try our 100 new drinks that we had at the state fair this year. And so it's a big thing. It's just pervasive through our culture. And then comparison, I know you have some data on the amount of people that can get treatment. We always talk about that, and that is not even close to the number of people that are struggling.
Yeah, there's a disproportionate number of access to care, right? And so, we have this prevalence of normalizing substances, but we also know that 1 in 7 Americans admit they have a substance use disorder. And so we have a growing number of folks in rural areas that recognize they have a problem, but accessing care is really out of reach. Only about 14% of US behavioral health outpatient treatment facilities are located in those rural communities. And we'll go ahead and throw some of these links up. I got that one from Rural Minds. Rural Minds is a really great website of accessing data and seeing some current research and information about rural areas. I love to go to Rural Minds to learn more. They
Mhm.
really have high quality information there. And so less than half of those specialize in treatment of substance use disorders. So there
Mm.
isn't treatment available in
Mhm.
rural areas. And, if you go back a couple of episodes, we talked about ASAM levels of care. We talked about how important a continuum of care and being able to access each level of that continuum, depending on what you need. And if you don't have access to that and you're surrounded with legal substances like alcohol being available and promoted, I think about small towns. If you want to go out for supper, where are you going to go out for supper? It's going to be a restaurant that's in the local bar, right?
Mhm.
That those two things are interconnected. And so I just think it's as we think about the data, as we think about the prevalence, we think about the stigma of admitting that you might have a problem, it really does set us up for failure in rural communities.
Right. And because to your point about prevention, that is just so absent. It's just automatically assumed that, you know, there's a lot more thinking about becoming 21 in the parties because now you've graduated into the age of drinking alcohol as if they hadn't been drinking before.
Right.
But, it's more like just a rite of passage that you just an assumption that you're going to drink it. And for those that then become addicted and cannot drink it, the world is not really structured or set up for them to not drink. And so I know I've got family and friends that did all the hard work of getting sober and working all on that, and then really hated it, just didn't like being sober,
Mhm.
didn't find that the things that they like to do conducive if they were into sports, events, alcohol's everywhere. If they wanted to go out and do anything at night with friends, it was everywhere. And there's not really a lot of opportunities for people that are in that sober space or want to stay sober. When you think about James Clear has written a book called Atomic Habits, and I love the book. But what he talks about is when you're making a new habit, make it easy to make the choice. Because if you have to, the harder to make the choice, the harder it's going to be to start with a habit. So you think like for yourself, if you're gonna, if I were gonna take up running, which I never will, it's like, a block or two, that you can do when you don't feel well. That's where you start because once you get that down and that's easy enough, you just trip over it and it happens. Because if you start out with, I'm going to run 3 miles every day, first of all, I'd never make one day. And that's his point. The same should happen in sobriety. We need to make it easy for people to be sober, but they're swimming upstream. The whole
Mhm.
culture is against them. So when they get to the point where they want to be sober or even stay sober, people who don't drink, I have a sibling that just doesn't like it. So much
Mhm.
pressure. People don't understand. Why don't you drink? Why
Mhm.
don't you like it? Why don't you try this? Oh, you haven't tried this one. And so on the prevention side, it's a lot of pressure. And then on trying to stay sober side and recovery side, a lot of pressure. And so the system just isn't set up for that.
And there is generational differences, right? There are some youth that the youth are actually drinking less in
Yeah.
some of the studies, right? It's because they're kind of like, no, that's just you old people drink too much. We've seen what it does to you, right? And that's real.
Yeah.
But I do think we need to get back to prevention. We've seen several state system redesigns, and the focus is always on crisis and acute
Right.
care
Right.
in the work that we do. And there's very little funds that go
Yep.
to prevention, that go to education. And that's what's missing in this conversation. And over again, I ask, where is anyone talking about prevention? We're in the middle of a huge state overhaul, a system redesign here in our own state, and prevention is on the back burner. It's the back burner of every conversation, of every meeting, of every stakeholder meeting, of every community meeting, every town hall meeting we go to, no one talks about prevention. Everyone talks about crisis, acute care, residential care, all the higher end levels of care, but not doing anything upstream. And it really frustrates me, Renee.
Yeah. And you think about that, that prevention is the same thing that the folks need on the recovery side. It's the same. And
Mhm,
so you're talking about the what are we supposed to do once we've completed treatment and we're not in crisis anymore? How should life look? And that's preventing the next relapse on that end. So prevention is
mhm,
really critical for the folks that have struggled that are now recovered and the folks that, never want to start in the first place. And you're right. We don't do a lot of this, and it's evidenced by everywhere you are when you can sit back and think of who the sponsors are at all these major events or who's the sponsor. There'll be sponsors that are alcohol or drug related at healthcare conferences.
mhm.
There'll be, and it's crazy. I know at the state fair, Bud and Mary's, the new CBD group, was loud and proud at the state fair in the Varied Industries building. And so they're just handing out free things to all the kids, and it's all the kids, right, that get the tattoos and
Right,
the fans and the whole
right.
thing. And so it's just like trying to make that normalized. Now that we've got alcohol so prevalent, cannabis is right
Mhm.
behind. We talked about this a little bit in the previous segment, and talk right behind them, trying to do the same thing where they're trying to just make it look fun and engaging, and so there's no consequences for taking it. And that's going to be a challenge if that is the next culture that we are just going to start assuming
And
is normal.
right. And if you're a conference organizer, just because you have a couple non-alcoholic beers in the lineup that you're
Yeah.
going to give to people doesn't necessarily mean that you're supporting recovery or you're reflecting anything, right? Think about how can you make sure you put some limits on things, because it can be uncomfortable for others when you have some folks who struggle in this area and may overconsume in some of these areas. We've all been at that conference and seen that happen,
Right.
and I think that that's part of a responsibility we have as a society of how can we do better in those areas of prevention and education. Setting some parameters and limits might be a start.
Yep. And I think about it in workplace, right? If all of your events that you're doing are alcohol centric, alcohol focused, you may not even realize you have employees that have struggled in this space or are currently struggling in this space or don't want to be in this space. And so, I know there was a department head who, upon reappointment, went out and had like a big happy hour bash at one of the bars in town. It was a restaurant with a bar or bar with a restaurant, one of the two. But the image of that, and then assuming that all of your coworkers want to come and celebrate with you at the bar, and then stories that were told afterwards, that's not very thoughtful of your employees that want to be part of that or not, or what the message is to those that maybe don't have that lifestyle, right? To your point. So you think about it from a workplace perspective too, and all things in moderation, but at the same time, if every event you do is around alcohol or even suggesting happy hours is the only time you want to get together socially, you're pushing people in
And
some tough
right.
spots.
And we're not saying every event has to be a dry event. We're just simply
No.
saying, are you thinking about it?
Yeah.
And do you have a plan that is inclusive of all? Because there might be some folks who are uncomfortable in those situations. And how do you spread it out, right? So that there can be events so that everyone can feel safe to be in attendance and to participate. And so I just think we need to put more thoughtfulness into it sometimes and mix things up. And knowing that, from a perspective that sometimes that's a draw to get people to something, and I understand
Mm,
that, but maybe that's part of where we've gone wrong as a society, and so that there becomes a bigger conversation then, that I think we really need to be having in workplaces and communities and everywhere that we live and recreate.
agreed. I agree. So the recovering politician self-care policy of the week, I've shared this before. I use a tracker now to track my sleep and my stress. And so it's been interesting to see what impacts that and what choices I make in my day if I'm paying attention impacts. And I can tell you straight up, alcohol impacts my sleep. I might be able to have one alcoholic beverage at lunchtime and have no impact on sleep, but that's the best I can do. And that isn't necessarily a guarantee. So that means everything post, noon is not going to work for me, which, okay. So I know, right? So if you're making choices, that's one thing. But one thing I have found out is that I've tried different things, and reading fiction actually helps my stress go down. And I thought, well, that's kind of crazy. So I started diving into that. And it's really about your mind and what it focuses on and what it thinks about and how your body registers stress. And so getting your mind focused on something else. So for some people, movement is a way to get your mind focused on something else, works really good. But for me, reading a fiction book does. And I have to be careful about what type of fiction, but if I'm reading books, and so I've decided that that's kind of some of my goals now is to read more just fun for fun. And that it actually has reduced my stress. And that is a surprise. That's not one I had like on my bingo card that I thought, hey, if I read this, it will make me less stressed. It just started being like, I'm noticing on this tracker that, hey, I'm less stressed. What's going on? I'm like, oh my gosh, I was just reading, nothing quote smart, nothing learning, nothing, just something. And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. And I've tested it over and over, and that's true for myself. So just letting people know out there might be things that can help you with stress and sleep that you haven't thought about that might not be that difficult. And reading a book is actually pretty easy for me. So Jason, does that bring up any thoughts for you in the space of stress and stress management?
The thought that came to me is probably completely not helpful, but it made me think that I know I'm stressed if all the mint leaves are gone off the mint plant because I've kind of gone through a mojito phase. Um,
Yeah, probably
that's
true.
all that went through my mind when you talked about this. So no, I don't think I have anything to contribute whatsoever, Renee.
So maybe you too need a different self-care plan other than mojitos. Might be a winning strategy right there. So today we talked about alcohol, really diving into like the world culture of it. It really is part of our culture and it's so pervasive. It's everywhere. So if that's how you feel about it, you're not wrong. It really just is all that we do in America to celebrate, to get together, to have fun, to do football, to do life. And so what does that do for people that are struggling, right? There adds that stigma component and a lot of pressure. And so how can we improve that? We really talked about that today about being thoughtful about people in the workplace, being thoughtful about those that need a little more help. And we provided you some resources again today that might be able to help you with your workforce. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you again next time. Have a great day.